Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give it a moment here while folks join in to our webinar this morning. Get started. All right. We'll continue to get attendees joining, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Allison Thompson. I'm the Scientific Program Director here at the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, or FFAR. Thank you to everyone for joining us today for our webinar, Science for Climate Smart Agriculture, Engaging Farmers as Collaborators to Accelerate Transition. We have 4 speakers today who have very different perspectives from the research and agricultural producer communities, and they'll be sharing insights from their work. This webinar is part of FFAR's 10-year anniversary celebration. We're looking back at our decade of impact and showcasing our vision for the future through this series of webinars. Next slide. If you aren't familiar with FFAR, we were created in the 2014 Farm Bill to build public-private partnerships that fund bold food and agricultural research. Over the past decade, we have funded hundreds of grants and worked with more than 550 partners across the food and agricultural value chain to advance agricultural innovation. Throughout this 10th anniversary year, we're hosting these monthly webinars, highlighting our research as well as the power of the collaborative public-private partnership model that underlies our work. To view any of the previously recorded webinars or sign up for future webinars, we have a few more coming this year, please visit foundationfar.org/impact. This webpage, you'll also find other content from our 10-year anniversary celebration. The topic of today's webinar is also the foundation for FFAR's Ag Mission Consortium, where research funders and farmer representatives work together to develop, understand, and achieve scale of climate-smart agricultural practices globally. We'll have time for questions afterwards, so as we go through the speakers, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. It's the best place to submit any questions for the speakers, and we will get to those as we go through and at the end. With that, one of our core partners in Ag Mission has been the World Farmers Organization, a global grassroots forum for national farmer organizations to work together on elevating the farmer's voice. They've been a strategic partner in Ag Mission representing those important conversations. And our first speaker and moderator for the webinar today is Macaulay Jones, who's the coordinator for WFO's Scientific Council. So he works very closely in this space between scientists and agricultural producers to help shape research initiatives at WFO, including global producer consultation efforts that has 2 research programs done over the last couple of years with Ag Mission. Macaulay holds a master's in international relations from the University of Melbourne, joining us from Berlin today, and he'll be speaking and then moderating for the other speakers. So Macaulay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alison, for the opportunity to be involved today and for your work at FFAR and partnering with the WFO, the World Farmers Organization. So as you mentioned, the World Farmers Organization, it's the largest independent farmer organization in the world. So we're made up of national farmer organizations. If we go to the next slide, thank you very much, Olivia. Quick off the gun. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're made up of national organizations and then split into constituencies, as you'd see there. So I think we've got many joining from America, and I think our American member is the National Farmers Union. And before I was working for the WFO, I was working for the Federated Farmers of New Zealand. But we've got members from pretty much every continent where there's agriculture anyway. And we're split into those constituency members, and each continent has a board member. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is at a very high level. This is what we do at the WFO. So fundamentally, it's at its core, the WFO brings farmers together, and it's amazing. You have farmers from half a dozen continents in a room, and what excites farmers and what frustrates farmers is remarkably similar. There might be different terms used and different nuances, but they're very similar. So we aim to build our membership, bring farmers together and their networking. We develop policies. We've got about a dozen policies at the WFO, and those policies represent the interests of small-scale farmers in the developing world, of farmers that practice organic or regenerative practices, farmers that are more larger scale and conventional farming, and they cover a breadth of issues, including trade, climate change, value chain. So it's a challenging process. We operate on consensus, but it's quite worthwhile, because once we have those policies, then we're able to advocate on behalf of all these farmers in international fora, including coming up quite soon at the COP29 event. We generally take a delegation there. As well as advocating on farmers' needs, we also try and build farmer capacity to make it easier for farmers to advocate for themselves. Generally, that's I think quite flattering to the WFO, and in a lot of cases it goes the other way. We learn from our members, but we'd like to think where we can, we help build capacity with the farmers. And recently, a large focus of that has been building capacity in the young farmers through the WFO Gymnasium program. If you go to the next slide, please, Olivia. So recently we've partnered with FFAR in an initiative called Ag Mission, and this has involved undertaking consultation with farmers to learn what's working, what's not working, what farmers think of regenerative agriculture, of climate smart agriculture, of all these terms that fly around that everyone has their own definition to. And we've undertaken the Global Producers Consultation, and that was undertaken in South Africa. It was pretty amazing to be involved in and to sit back. It was, I think, about 200 farmers in a room sharing insights, and that was complemented with online work undertaken by my colleague Lorenzo, and recently published in a report that's available online. And currently we're working off the back of a similar in-person project carried out by the WFO and FFAR in Rome on the sidelines of the WFO's General Assembly, and that's focused on youth, as I said, and that's the World Youth Farmer Youth Consultation. So that's what we're up to now, and I will end my presentation now, because we have far more interesting and impressive speakers than myself. So I'll now change to introducing our first speaker, which I'm very excited to do. So bring it up. So our first speaker is Dr. Laura Gentry, and Laura Gentry, since 2014, has directed the research of water quality for the Illinois corn growers over in the States, for the Illinois Corn Growers Association and the Illinois Corn Marketing Board. And she's also the adjunct faculty member at the University of Illinois. Dr. Gentry's research focuses on regenerative agricultural practices, nutrient management, and also focuses on the soil conservation in US Midwest cropping systems. As part of Dr. Gentry's research, she analyzes financial and environmental impacts of conservation practices, adoption using aggregated and anonymized data with farmers. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Laura Gentry.
Hi, good morning. Thanks a lot, Macaulay. Really appreciate the introduction, and really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar and celebrate 10 years of great research that's been being done by the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. Would like to say that representing Illinois corn growers and this program that we launched, the Precision Conservation Management Program, we have benefited a lot directly from FFAR's work, and that has been through the direct financial funding that they have provided to help this program, this little program that started back in 2015, to grow into what it is today. And they have been a big part of the success of our effort, but also indirectly we have benefited from the work that FFAR has done over the past 10 years. And that has been through good decisions and good strategic making that Allison and her team there at FFAR have done to really help to find work that works together, that dovetails, that supports each other, just all of us working towards this, the ag mission, the agricultural mission that we all share, which is ultimately to support and to catalyze the faster adoption and the scaling of conservation practices on agricultural land across the United States, and as we will see, even beyond that. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Olivia. The Precision Conservation Management Program, just a little bit of background on us. We were established by the Illinois Corn Growers Association in 2015. We launched with the help of a Regional Conservation Partnership Program grant for $5.35 million then. And now we have over 30 partners that support this program directly. FFAR is one of those. We work, we have a heavy focus on working with commodity associations. So we work with commodity associations in Illinois, Kentucky, and Nebraska. And we also work across the supply chain. We have corporate partners that help us now. The PepsiCo is the largest one of those. Currently, we're excited to be adding others in here. We'll be announcing that very soon. We work in 3 states, Illinois, Nebraska, and Kentucky. And we have over 600 farmers in our program now. We started with just 58 farmers back in 2016 when we started enrolling farmers. We have over 500,000 acres now in Illinois and Kentucky and Nebraska. Well, PCM is first and foremost what we are. Precision Conservation Management is a farmer service program. We're not for profit. We are led by the Illinois Corn Growers Association, and that means we're funded predominantly by farmer checkoff dollars. So we work for farmers. We have to be sure that first and foremost, our focus is on representing, serving, and supporting farmers. And also over half of our administrative team and the specialists that work with our program are actively engaged in farming. And that's another important factor in helping us to be better supporters of the farmers that we work with directly and indirectly. So the way it works, when a farmer enrolls in the PCM program, they get their own PCM specialist. In the state of Illinois, we have got 8 PCM specialists. So we have 8 regions in Illinois. We have 2 regions in Nebraska, and we have 1 region in Kentucky, soon to be 2 regions in Kentucky. And every region or every specialist essentially supports up to 100 farmers. Somewhere between 90 and 100 farmers is usually the capacity of the farmer, of the specialist in our program. So that's how that works. We created the PCM program to provide farmers with objective and regionally relevant information about the financial costs. We take a strong focus on the financial aspects, the labor, the time, the management costs to our farmers that's associated with adopting and scaling conservation practices on their corn, soybean, and wheat acres in the states of Illinois and Kentucky and Nebraska. Before PCM was launched, there was essentially no information from the farmer's perspective about these enterprise-wide costs and benefits of using cover crops, nitrogen management, and tillage reductions. Those are the 3 practice standards that we really focus on in the PCM program. So in PCM, they have access to experts through their PCM specialists. We have a very strong focus on data. That's one of the big roles actually of the PCM specialists, is to help the farmers in our program to enter the data accurately and with the least amount of clicks and typing for the farmer. The specialist will do all of it for them on the farmer's behalf. And that's usually how it works 99% of the time. The specialist sits down with the farmer and at their house, at their kitchen table, in their barn, in their office, and starts entering all this information for their full analysis. And then within the PCM program, we collect all this agronomic management data for them. We pair it up with soils data and weather data and financial data to create for them this personal data analysis, a report. We call it a resource analysis and assessment plan. And the specialists deliver this to the farmers in February and March of each year for the previous growing season. And we go over how the farmer, with their tillage practice, their cover crop practice, their nitrogen management practice is doing in terms of their financials and then also in terms of their environmental assessments. So we have to bring in a lot of data, and we bring in a lot of research to help our farmers to present alternative, maybe more conservation focused practices that the farmer may consider. And we use models, we use information, or we use the field to market field print calculator to provide data, as well as the Cool Farm tool, the model to provide greenhouse gas estimates, soil erosion estimates, water quality, energy use, and biodiversity estimates for the farmer, in addition to all of the financial tables that we provide. And then, although the program didn't really start with a lot of these cost share opportunities back in 2015, we just had the RCPP dollars to provide to farmers in terms of incentivizing their practices or costing it down or reducing their risk. Today, as you know, there's just a glut, essentially, of these cost share opportunities for farmers in the program. And we make all of those available to the farmer so that they can really find out what's the best fit for them in terms of the terms, the contracts, and help them to be sure that they understand what they're enrolling in. And a lot of that that we offer is through the PepsiCo program and the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities that PepsiCo is also working with us in. So we offer a lot of those opportunities as well. So next slide, please. So we mentioned that we do have a big data focus, and some of you will be familiar with this particular graphic here. So I had never even seen this graphic until I started looking into Dr. Linda Prokopy's work. And it has really changed the entire trajectory of how we work with farmers. It's changed the approach that we use. The research that she has done has really helped us to work with our farmers far more effectively. And maybe nobody's been more surprised by how effective it's been than me. As a soil scientist, I wasn't always as generous in my thinking, perhaps, about how we could affect practices until I started understanding the power of some of the work that she has done, because it's so very pragmatic. And so what we have done in the program, thinking about this graphic here, is we have strategically directed our specialists to start working more towards adopting this early majority of farmers. We feel like we're doing a very good job of capturing many of the innovators and the early adopters into the PCM program. They come to us. They want to be in the program because of everything that we offer. Now we're trying to bridge that chasm to get into this early majority of farmers. And the work that Dr. Prokopy and others have done have really helped us to train our specialists. In fact, in every one of our trainings, this graphic or some version of it, which is, I guess I should have mentioned, it's the Rogers, you might have to help me here, Linda, whenever it's your turn, the Rogers something of innovation. You can fill me in on that. You can fill in the blank on that one. But we use this to help train our specialists and to give them the resources that she's really developed this quite a bit to help them to work with our farmers more. So next slide. So within the PCM program, take one step back here for all the data analysis goals that we have. We want to use the PCM data that we collect to, of course, support our PCM farmers, the ones that are directly enrolled in the program. But every one of those farmers, in addition to the RAP report that they get every year and the support that we get through different kinds of funding, they know that their data is in an aggregated and anonymized way also going to help the farmers right around them, essentially their competitors, to just help to make all of agriculture more efficient and more conservation focused. It's also going even broader than that to help farmers across the Midwest. And then finally, we want our data to also help to support the work of the good academics and the good researchers, such as many of those that are working with FFAR, so that they can do more and better work to help right back up, starting at the top of the cycle, then again, helping the PCM specialists, to help the PCM farmers, to help the data. So the first way and the one I wanted to focus on real quickly is our annual report, this resource analysis and assessment plan. Let's bring up those pictures. This is what that looks like. This is our specialists bringing out that report and helping our farmers. So this is what that looks like, sitting down with them, sharing that data out with them, and then challenging them. So next slide. to help them to make good decisions. So as we're training our specialists about how to deliver those wraps, we're telling them, this is why you need to do a good job. You're helping these farmers to reduce their risks. And the farmers see it that way. We're speaking directly to the goals and motivations because we know those farmers. We know what their goals, what their motivations are. And it's very different for the earlier adopters than it is for this early majority, the more pragmatic farmers. And then specifically trying to bring in more of these pragmatic farmers when we identify a farmer as being in that, we tell them, make the recommendation, but don't push too hard because we know this group of farmers, based on work that Dr. Prokopy and others have done, we know that no right now doesn't mean no next year, or it might even mean no next year, but it doesn't mean no the next year because these farmers are always taking in this information to try to make it work for them in a very pragmatic way. So last slide, please. So our takeaways in our program based on some good research is we're always trying to reduce risk with good data. We're trying to help the farmer to feel supported by building relationships with the specialists, but also with other farmers in the program. And we're always trying to solve the problems that they see, the challenges they see with these conservation practices. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Macaulay. And I thank you all very much for letting me have a few minutes to share how we're using this research.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's fantastic to hear about the program you're running, the PCM program. If there's one thing farmers dislike as much as risk and management risk and financial risk, it's clicks and typing and entering the same data multiple times. So it's great to hear about how you're reducing all three aspects and a very farmer-centric approach. The next speaker I have the honor to introduce is the aforementioned Dr. Linda Prokopy. So Dr. Linda Prokopy is a professor and department head in the Department of Horticulture, and Landscape Architecture at Purdue University. She is an interdisciplinary social scientist who is recognized nationally and internationally for her work incorporating social science, as you see with that chart, into the fields of agricultural conservation, into the fields of agricultural adaptation to climate change, and last but not least into watershed management, or what sometimes called water catchments down the bottom of the world where I'm from. Linda is currently the Principal Director for a $10 million sustainable agricultural systems grant that is focused on diversifying the agricultural landscape of the Corn Belt in the US. Linda is currently the project director for, I've got that one. Sorry, so without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Linda Prokopy.
Thanks, Macaulay. A pleasure to be with you all today. Just want to give a shout out to my postdoc, Dr. Elsie Hassan, who is the one who's actually leading the research that I am going to be presenting on today that's focused on farmers' persistent use of cover crops. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background. Here in the US and around the world, we give, and as you just heard from Laura in Illinois with her programming, we give farmers a lot of technical and cost share support to adopt different agricultural practices. And the one that we're focused on in this particular research is cover crops, there's a great interest in cover crop adoption here in the US at the present time for climate smart agricultural purposes, water quality, soil health, all types of different reasons that we want to increase the adoption of cover crops. So we know that when we give farmers technical and cost share support, we were able to increase the adoption rates. Those programs largely operate on the assumption that after we give somebody some initial money and some initial technical support for 3 years or so to get them started with cover crops, that when we withdraw the financial support, farmers are going to continue to use cover crops. So that assumption hasn't been thoroughly tested, but our working hypothesis is that that's not always the case. That in many cases, that when the cost share support goes away, the farmers disadopt or change how they're using the practice. But there have been very few studies that have looked at cover crop use or really continued use of any conservation practice after cost share contracts end. And I'm going to give a shout out. So Laura, the name you were thinking of earlier was Everett Rogers, the diffusion of innovations. And the diffusion of innovations curve that we always look at is that bell-shaped curve that Laura showed, where we see the early adopters and the innovators on one side and what Rogers called the laggards, increasingly called skeptics on the far end, the right-hand side of that distribution. The other thing that Rogers did in his theory, diffusion of innovations, he did a lot. The book is a theory that, or the theory is a book that often gets condensed to the bell-shaped curve. The other piece he did was look at a progression of adoption. So first people have to be knowledgeable, then they have to form positive attitudes towards a practice, then they have to intend to use a practice, then they have to adopt a practice. And the final step of Rogers' framework was what he called, commitment. So that committed use to continuing to use a practice. So after adoption, is it continued? And that work, there's been very, very little bit of work. Very, very little research on that over time. So we have been digging into that work with our next slide, please, with looking at research questions of what informs farmers' decisions to either continue or discontinue using cover crops after cost share contracts end, and what informs farmers' decisions to discontinue cover crops use after they end. So I guess it's the same question. So sorry about that. All right, carry on. We'll go to the next slide. So brief description of interview participants. We started out with interviews. So we have some funding from USDA, NIFA, National Institute for Food and Agriculture, to do interviews of farmers in Indiana, which is, for those of you not from the US, is right next to Illinois, where Laura's located, just a little bit to the east, a little bit southeast of Chicago, which most folks tend to be able to place Chicago on a map. So we're near Chicago, and we grow a lot of corn and soybeans. Moving east towards Maryland. Maryland is on the Atlantic coast, so actually drains into the Atlantic. Most of Maryland drains into the Atlantic through the Chesapeake Bay. So we've been doing interviews with farmers in those two states, picking those two states because they have very different regulatory environments for cover crop adoption. So there is no regulatory requirement for cover crops in Indiana. Maryland, there's more of a requirement to use cover crops, and there's a lot more cost share support for doing it. So it's a very friendly kind of regulatory environment where we will help you do it. But still, trying to understand, even in that environment, what motivates the continued use. So we've been interviewing farmers, and by we, I mean Elsie, has been interviewing farmers in Indiana and Maryland. And you can see here, mostly male, which is pretty representative of who's doing the farming, but we've also been able to talk to a couple of women. Most of them have a high school diploma, age ranges from 36 to 84 years. Most of the farmers we have talked to have continued or intend to continue using cover crops after their contract ends, but we have been able to talk to a few who have discontinued. As you can imagine, when you call people up and say, we want to talk to you about your experience with cover crops, those who have had a good experience are the ones who tend to say yes, and those who've had a bad experience tend to say no. So we've had a hard time tracking down some of the users who have discontinued the use. So the next slide here, we have isolated some different factors that inform the continued use of cover crops. So you can see here environmental factors leading to continued use. So here's a farmer from Indiana saying, we always use cover crops in that location because there's a really high chance of erosion. So that farmer being very cognitive, very aware of the issues on their land and using cover crops to address those issues. Economic factors, of course, we know economics are frequently a factor for decision making. And here's a farmer from Maryland seeing the economic benefit of growing cover crops because they can use those crops to feed their animals. So they're getting the advantage of protecting soil quality, which they also speak about in this quote, but also the advantage of feeding their animals. And then government mandates. So we see in Maryland that they feel like they're forced to use it anyway, but so that's obviously a factor that informs cover crop persistence. The next slide shows three more factors here. So soil health benefit, a lot of farmers mentioning they think they get some soil health benefits from using cover crops. Farmers here just saying it seems like the right thing to do. after talking to different people at soil and water conservation districts, looking through different agricultural trade magazines, and then the ongoing availability of resources, especially in Maryland, where there's this ongoing cost share availability, that I'm going to keep doing them. I've been covering it most out of pocket anyway, and so now there's funding, I'm going to keep doing this practice. We do, of course, have identified some barriers to ongoing use of cover crops, from the farmers who have continued to use, but also from farmers who have farmers who discontinued, but also farmers who have continued to use, but have changed how they're using cover crops once cost share funding goes away. So some of the barriers to cover crop persistence that we have identified are market conditions. The seed is expensive, the chemical to terminate is expensive. It's just not, the ROI is just not there. Management complexity, adding cover crops to your farming operation clearly adds another layer of complexity, and that's why they're probably not adopted more. And then resources available. We tend to think about resources in terms of money, and that's why we talk about cost share a lot, but the timing to apply cover crops or plant cover crops and then terminate cover crops, having both the time to do that and the labor to do that. And then here, another resource availability focused on the actual financial needs. So those barriers are quite relevant, as I said, amongst both continuing users and discontinuing users. The next phase of our work is to finalize our interviews in Indiana and Maryland, and then we're using the results of those interviews to write a survey that we'll be sending out in the Midwestern part of the US, so Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and I think southeastern Minnesota, to look at determinants of cover crop persistence and what that persistence looks like. So what we have found in our interviews is that even the farmers who continue using cover crops, they change how they are using the cover crops when cost share money goes away. So they often reduce acreage that they're planting cover crops to. They plant at a lower seed rate. They use a more simple seed mix, and they change how they are applying cover crops. So we want to understand both what's explaining continued use and discontinued use, but also changed use of cover crops, which I think will be greatly informative to agencies and groups like Laura's in Illinois, as they are thinking about how do we increase the use of cover crops, not just for the 3 years of a cost share contract, but on into perpetuity. So this work has been funded by, next slide, please. The interview work has been funded by USDA NIFA, and our current work where we're writing the survey and we'll be conducting the survey to be able to generalize the findings from the interview is funded by FFAR. For the NIFA work, we're partnering with Johns Hopkins and Dr. Paul Ferraro's group there. And the FFAR work is also supported by the Nature Conservancy, and we're partnering with them on that work. So we're very grateful, of course, for all of that funding support that lets us answer really, really critical questions to really be able to make a change on the landscape. And I'm grateful to FFAR for helping us do that. And I will turn it back to Macaulay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Linda, for sharing those insights into your work. Yeah, very interesting, and yeah, really resonated with me. And well done on getting information from farmers, not just the ones that are on the would it be the left-hand side of that bell curve, but towards the middle or the right. And it's particularly difficult. And just a reminder for everyone dialing in that if you have any questions, we'll address them at the end of the panel. We'll have a panel discussion, and if you just pop them in the Q&A function, and then we'll make sure to log them all in. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Andrew Shepherd, who is the director of the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network, and is also an honorary research associate at the Institute of Development Studies. Andrew has had a prolific career working as a social scientist on areas as critical as rural development, an issue of passion to many of the WFO members, poverty reduction, and of course, was most recently the lead author of the Chronic Poverty Report that focused on pandemic poverty. Finally, Andrew is also, apologies, Andrew is also a senior research assistant at ODI London, I believe the Open Data Institute in London, where he's been for 2 decades. And Andrew is currently leading work on inclusive, sustainable, and economic transformation. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Andrew Shepherd.
Hello, everybody, and it's great to be part of this congratulatory series for FFAR. And I'm also learning a lot about US agriculture, which is really interesting. Macaulay, I'm very sorry that it was such a mouthful introducing me. If I'd known you were going to read it out, I wouldn't have written it like that. But anyway, to the topic of discussion. If you could move on a slide, please, Olivia. So this work that I'm going to tell you a little bit about was supported by FFAR and also by the Syngenta Foundation. And we at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, UK, partnered with World Vision International and some of their national offices and with local researchers in 3 of the countries that I will talk about in a minute. The focus of this work is very much on low-income and middle-income countries. So it's kind of quite a counterpoint to what we've just heard about in the US. Yeah, so up on the slide, you can see a number of things that we did. And I will report today a little bit about the literature review, a little bit about the case study countries, Kenya, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. Also a little bit about climate finance and offer up a bit of a conclusion at the end. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Olivia, thank you. So this was from the literature review. And we found quite a few myths hanging around about CSA. One myth was that there was kind of low levels of understanding of CSA and particularly low levels of adoption of CSA approaches and technologies. And I think the finding that we had from that is that adoption isn't carefully enough assessed a lot of the time. And actually, farmers had high levels of understanding, and they're doing lots of adaptation to the changing climate. So they kind of understand, farmers' understanding corresponds very closely with the understanding produced by meteorological officers. So they're doing lots of adaptation themselves. The second myth was that there are information and skill deficits, and we found that there was a little bit of truth in that, but also that farmers were typically much more skilled and their skills were underestimated, and indigenous technical knowledge was also underestimated. And farmers do have a tremendous repository of knowledge to fall back on in thinking about the changes that they need to make to their farming systems. A third myth was, I mean, all of these myths have a grain of truth in them, around capital shortage. And yes, I mean, you know, the typical farmer in a developing country does not have much savings, does not have access to good financial services. So yes, there is a capital shortage, but many of the adaptations that farmers make, like planting earlier or planting earlier maturing varieties, don't necessarily involve a huge amount of investment. However, to get more rapid and deeper change, some of the things that farmers want to invest in, like irrigation, mechanization, and livestock, do require capital, and that capital may not be available. Another issue is that labor may be scarce too, and I'll come back to that point in just a minute. And a fourth myth is that institutions, particularly around land tenure, stopped people adopting, but we didn't find any evidence or much evidence of this in the literature. Just that point about labor. If you could go on to the next slide, please, Olivia. I talked through that slide, actually. No, the one before that, I'm so sorry. That's right, with a nice picture. So these are Zai pits in Burkina Faso. And this is an indigenous technology which traps water and, if it's available, additional fertility in a hole which is dug in the ground, and crops grow in a very arid environment in that hole. A colleague of mine, Ian Schoons, once said, "Do you think asking people on low incomes to dig 10,000 holes per hectare is a way to escape hunger?" Have you tried digging 10,000 holes? Well, it's a pretty good comment. I mean, labor has opportunity costs. You know, if you put labor into something, you can't put it into something else. Or it has hiring costs. If you can't do it yourself, you have to hire somebody to do it. And I think one of the things that we've found in the literature, for example, the literature on Zambian conservation agriculture, which has been quite heavily promoted among smallholders for about 20 years, is that people do adopt it, but they can disadopt it as well when they find that, particularly when they find that it involves too much labor or too much capital or access to inputs that they don't easily obtain. But the labor constraint is a very important one. If you could go to the next slide, please, Olivia. What did we find in the three countries that we worked in, Bangladesh, Kenya, and Indonesia? And these were the findings of our research partners in those countries. So first of all, we found farmers generally having very high awareness, as I said previously, on the nature of climate change, and very high levels of demand for changes in the way that they do their farming, and demand for information, demand for assistance with making those changes. So I think the conclusion that we can take from this is that the kind of training and awareness raising which has been done on CSA has been quite effective, particularly in Kenya and Bangladesh, less so in Indonesia. There's been less work done in Indonesia over the last 10 years. We did find quite a bit of variation between the three countries. We found farmers making more changes in Bangladesh, and we attributed this to several factors. One is that public expenditure on agricultural development, including extension and investment in infrastructure, is significantly greater in Bangladesh than either of the other two countries. So I think that one could say from this that where countries are investing in agriculture, changes in a climate-smart direction are likely to go more quickly. We also found quite a varied policy environment. So, for example, Kenya had a dedicated CSA policy from 2016, but it hadn't provided a budget to support it. So it was dependent on donors to support this budget. Bangladesh, as I mentioned, had a much stronger budget for agricultural development, but no specific policies. But that didn't stop farmers moving in the right direction in terms of adopting climate smart practices. And in Indonesia, the policy environment was much weaker. Perhaps interactions between the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Agriculture were quite weak, and there wasn't as a result of that, there weren't the programs and so on to work with farmers. Farmers were nevertheless aware of climate change, and they were adapting as and when they could. There were some constants which were quite interesting across the three countries, and I think probably across a wider group of countries as well. Traders were the main source of information, not extension agents or technical sources, if you like. And traders are never incorporated into development programming. So there seems to be a major gap there. The value chains are really important. A second constant across the three countries was that farmers were not really benefiting from very much else apart from training and awareness raising. And that's important because there were barriers to adoption. I've mentioned poverty and lack of finance there. So farmers, you know, if they want to invest, as I said, in some of the more financially demanding supports to climate smart agriculture like irrigation or livestock, they might find it difficult. There were also many of the farmers that we talked to mentioned that output prices, commodity prices could be very volatile and sometimes were decreasing over time, while input prices were increasing. And I think that's partly a phenomenon of the recent era when input prices have been increasing very dramatically. But it's very clear that, you know, that the market determines the extent to which farmers are going to take up many of these innovations. And if you could move to the next slide, which is kind of at a different level on climate finance. So what I would say here is that, I mean, I think we're all very aware of the growing volumes of funding being raised in the name of the changing climate. And agriculture has been a growing beneficiary of some of this climate finance. Indeed, one of our interviewees for this program mentioned that the start of climate smart agriculture, that FAO took climate smart agriculture up in around 2010 in order to get agriculture funded through climate finance. So it was quite a far-sighted effort by FAO. And the same person told us that she thought that the objective had been achieved, that there was now good recognition of the importance of agriculture within climate finance. However, what did we find? We found that, and I think this is a fairly common finding, that not much of the kind of globally raised climate finance gets down to farmers. A little bit gets into infrastructure. So we found the World Bank, for example, investing in irrigation infrastructure to a degree. But in terms of getting finance more directly to farmers to assist them with the change process, that seemed to be quite a gap there, and a lot more work needs to be done. And similarly, given the importance of the private sector, you would expect there to be investments coming out of climate finance into private sector agencies that are supporting climate smart agriculture, but there was very little equity finance, and this would again seem an important area to improve on. There are other things which need improving, which are that, you know, programs take a long time to be funded, and very often national institutions are neglected in this, but I'll leave that for now. And if you could move on to the next and final slide, Olivia, thank you. So as a conclusion, we think that climate smart agriculture needs a systems or a multi-stakeholder approach. At the core of this would be benefits to farmers, recognition of the climate mitigation that agriculture does or could supply through payment for environmental services. Regular payments would provide a strong basis for financial inclusion, and this is something that climate finance could major on in the coming period, solving the measurement and institutional problems along the way. And I think this would transform the incentive environment for the farmers that we spoke to. The small changes that farmers are able to make may over time add up to significant transformation. However, there are limits to what they can do unsupported. Ministries of Agriculture need to gear up for much stronger research, extension, and investment. I was very struck, Laura, by your statement that you had one specialist for 100 farmers. In the countries that we're talking about, it's one specialist for thousands of farmers. And the number of thousands varies from country to country. Sometimes you have a low-level extension agent who deals with hundreds of farmers, but the specialists are really rare. And I think it's specialists that farmers want to interact with rather than general kind of not very high-level extensionists. So collaboration across ministries is really important here. One of the things that we found was that ministries of agriculture are often not very strong on pushing what you might call the environmental agenda, and that it's ministries of environment who push this. And where they have a collaborative relationship with the Ministry of Agriculture, it comes along. But where that collaboration doesn't exist so strongly, the Ministry of Agriculture can be quite, if you like, backward on these issues. So there is an issue about the rate of change in thinking and policy making in ministries of agriculture. There are exceptions here. So, for example, Rwanda, which is still a low-income country, has brought climate change into all policy areas. And there are good examples in Latin America, which our research didn't actually touch. And then a final point, context specificity is vital. That there's not a lot that you can do in a top-down fashion, that the right approaches to farm development have to be developed with farmers, and I'm sure that you would all agree on that. So there's lots of tools out there. There's agroecological approaches, regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, but it's all got to fit in with the particular farming systems and market systems and so on that are available in a locality. Very few universal solutions. And what we also found was that many of the external programs don't start with farmers' own solutions to problems. They start with an externally developed or externally imposed solution. And we think that much more attention is needed to farmers' own solutions and building on those. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that excellent presentation. And yeah, it really fits in well with the previous speakers, Laura and Linda, and zooms out. So very, very interesting work. And yeah, I'd love to be a fly on a wall when you ask someone if they'd like to dig 10,000 holes. It's very good insight and something that I've certainly learned at the WFO, that we don't always consider the perspective of other farmers adequately. So we've got great questions in the Q&A section. So thanks for everyone that's popped those questions in. And the first question I'll give to Andrew, just as your last speaker. We'll go on a snake draft. Is it a provocative statement? But would you agree with it, or do you think there's something more to it? And the questioner asks, I think it's John McNamara asks, would you say it's fair to say that farmers basically know what to do on their farms to promote CSA practices, but they need incentives and more government support to do it, rather than telling farmers what to do? They just need more financial support. Is that a fair statement, or is it more complicated than that?
I think that's a pretty good start. It doesn't, I mean, government or other investment, however, I think what we found was that there are significant variations in the extent of farmers' knowledge of solutions. I mean, I think farmers can always find a solution in their own repertoire or in their own communities of practice, but it may not be the optimal solution. And there may be other solutions which they're not getting access to. They haven't had access to the information. So I think we found a significant level of appreciation of the kind of training and awareness raising programs. And many of the farmers groups that we talked to said they wanted more of that. So I think, as well as knowing stuff, they're very open to knowing more, and they're very open to science. They're very open to scientific expertise. We didn't find any challenge to that, really. But I think the profitability issue with, private sector has to set the right market conditions for this. And we found very little bringing in of the private sector to policy making or program development on climate smart agriculture. So private sector actors are kind of absent, which is a great shame, I think. But then government investment at the bottom is absolutely necessary, not just for CSA, but for good agricultural development.
Thank you very much. We've also got a question here regarding basically the list of reasons why farmers didn't continue their cover cropping practices and other climate smart agricultural practices as highlighted by Linda. I'd ask Dr. Laura Gentry, do these reasons given by Linda's research, do they resonate with your work in the PCM, the precision conservation management practices, and with your work with the one-on-one work with farmers? Do you hear similar reasons around practicality and sort of issues with staffing and complexity, or are there other insights that perhaps haven't made it in Linda's report that come across a lot with your work with farmers directly?
Yes, every quote that she provided up there, I've heard some version of that among the farmers that we work with. There was not a single one where I read it and thought, oh, that seems odd. No, everyone was very representative of the farmers we work with. And, whether it was the farmers in Maryland who were concerned about regulation, or the farmers, in Indiana, or farmers in Illinois, or anywhere, I think they're all thinking, about the regulation piece of that, but also the payment piece of it, which Andrew was just discussing, these practices that we're asking farmers to do to conserve some resource, whether it's water or climate issues or whatever, they come with a cost to the farmer. And the farmer always thinks this is something new and different. It costs me more time, more labor. It introduces more risk. It's more management. And I understand that it's some good for society, but it's ultimately making me less profitable. And it impacts me in a negative way. And so they would like to see more either help from private. And I don't see some farmers prefer more of the private dollars. They would rather interact with somebody on the private side. Others would see it the other way. This might be different in other countries, but in the United States, there's some who would prefer not to take federal dollars to do something because of what they perceive as strings attached to it or added complexity.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, it's a really good point. We hear a lot about financial costs, but also that cost of complexity and practicality. My parents are farmers, and when they had five kids trying to run a farm, I'd love to be a fly on the wall when someone tried to introduce them with some new practice, even if it was at a low cost. So the next question I'll ask Linda as we do the rounds of the panelists. There's a question around the accountability of funds, particularly government funds that are directed at climate smart agriculture, referencing an Oxfam report pointing to how much I think we've got. Anyway, Oxfam report pointing to basically a lack of knowing where the money's going. The question, I guess, I'd sort of frame it as is how do we balance? We don't want to spend all day. I think Laura talked about reducing the amount of clicks and typing farmers do. We don't want farmers spending all day filling out reports on what they've been doing. They're good at farming. They don't get into farming to fill out paperwork. But how to ensure that the public money or private money is accounted for and is going to the right places and not being wasted.
That's a very loaded question. I have to be careful how I answer that one. I will say. I do think that the persistence piece is a large part of that, right? I think that we certainly here in the US, we have worked with farmers, cost shared, practice adoption without thinking about long-term sustainability and long-term persistence of that practice. And I think that's quite irresponsible. Because for a lot of the practices, we really don't see, like cover crops. If you use cover crops 3 years, then you discontinue use. We haven't really seen public benefits in the long term, right? And so I think it's fair to ask if that's a good use of public money, right? And I think we have been neglecting looking at that continued use for a very long time, certainly here in the US. And I think that's one way to to try to focus on more accountability is try to understand that persistence. And then as we're even giving out initial cost share contracts, like, working with people who we understand, we think maybe are more likely to continue using once the money's gone away. If someone is only adopting because of the money and they have no other interest, right, they probably aren't going to continue using it when the money's gone. So,
yeah. Very, very well answered. And yeah, it's a balancing act, right? We don't want to be so risk adverse that no farmers put up their hands, but we do want to make sure that we're getting good spending for money. And I think we are basically bang on time. So I'll hand back to Alison perhaps to wrap it up and thank everyone. But yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for all our panelists.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to our panelists for great presentations. I think we've heard a lot about challenging assumptions using social science and using that information and our lessons from challenging those assumptions to help groups like PCM and others develop more effective programs. So really appreciate everyone coming together for this webinar. The recording will be available online. You'll get an email, and that will be available from the Foundation's website. They're listed at the bottom, as well as emails for the speakers today. If you would like to follow up on any questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to do that. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you all very much.